Hey YouTube fam, welcome to Share the Scare with Lady Shar. I'm Lady Shar. Thank you for joining me today. Today we have a true crime story for you, and the reason I decided to do this particular true crime story is because I actually know or knew two of the victims, and they lived next door to my mom when she lived in town. I live in the country outside of a small town of under 15,000 people called Chickasha, Oklahoma. And my grandparents had a house on Minnesota Avenue. My great grandmother had a house next door. And my great uncle had a house across the street. So this is a place, very poor part of town, but a place I'm very familiar with. When my mom decided to move to the country, to my sister's place several years ago, she sold her place to Mr. and Mrs. Pye, who were her next door neighbors and her friends. And my mom passed away in January, so I can't help but be thankful that she didn't have to learn about this case that I'm talking about, because it's horrific. So let me give you a warning that this is a very graphic case and it does involve cannibalism. So if you don't want to watch this, I understand. Please click off now. If this is not something you want to hear about. So, in what used to be my great-grandmother's house, Mr. and Mrs. Pye lived. And in mid-January of this year, Mr. Pye's nephew, Lawrence Paul Anderson, is 42 years old, and he got an early release from prison. Now, this was his third time being in prison. He had been convicted of his assaulting his girlfriend and threatening her with a gun in 2006. He had drug charges for crack, cocaine, and intent to distribute in 2012, and then another drug and violence charge, I think, in 2017. And somehow his sentence got commuted down from 20 years to 9, and then he was released early from prison on January 18th, 2021. He had originally put down that he was going to Texas to work in the oil field and live with his daughter. He didn't. He ended up going to Chickasha and living with his uncle, and he changed his address to his aunt and uncle's address without them even knowing, from what I've heard. Now, this is an open case, so not all of the details are going to be, exact, but I'm going to piece it together as best I can for you. So that's kind of the background of what happened. So Mr. Anderson was released from prison January 18th, 2021. 3 weeks later, I had heard that when he first got out of prison, he hung out in McAllister, which is where the prison is, for a few weeks before heading to Chickasha and showing up on Mr. and Mrs. Pye's doorstep. And it being Mr. Pye's nephew, he let him stay there even though he really didn't want to. He kind of felt obligated. Well, on February the 9th, Lawrence Paul Anderson allegedly went to 227 Minnesota Avenue, which was right down the street, across the street. Went to the back door, busted it in, and killed Andrea Lynn Blankenship, age 41. He not only killed her, but he cut her open and removed her heart. He took her heart with him and went back to 214 Minnesota Avenue, where Mr. and Mrs. Pye lived, and they were babysitting their 4-year-old granddaughter. So, Lawrence Paul Anderson comes in and he cooks the heart and sautés it with potatoes and tries to force Mr. and Mrs. Pye and their granddaughter to eat it. They refuse. He becomes more and more violent. And he stabs Mr. Pye to death. And he stabs Mrs. Pye in both eyes, and he stabs the 4-year-old little girl. And her name, and I'm not sure if I'm saying this right, is Chaos Yates. So Mrs. Pye is stabbed in both eyes. She can't see. She can only hear what's going on. And she has her phone kind of under her body. And she dials 911. And Lawrence is still in the house. And he thinks she's dead, so she's, trying to be quiet and dial 911. And when the police show up, they can hear her yelling for help. They break into the house. Lawrence Paul Anderson is there, and he's throwing up. Maybe he realized what he had done. And so they arrest him, and he is also injured from the fight. I imagine Mr. Pye fought as hard as he could to save his wife and granddaughter. And so Lawrence is taken to the hospital. Mrs. Pye, Delcy, is taken to the hospital. And when the police are interrogating him, they find out that he has also killed Andrea Blankenship. and they have to take all of the dishes, cooking utensils, and everything from the Pye household for evidence because he cooked Andrea Blankenship's heart with potatoes and served it to Mr. and Mrs. Pye. Mrs. Pye has recovered enough that she's out of the hospital. Everything was removed from her home and replaced. She's back living there. And the fear, the horrific nature of this crime, it's just mind-boggling. There are some indications that Mr. Anderson had mental issues. I believe when he was sentenced to prison in 2017, he did tell the judge that he was on bipolar medication, and I doubt seriously that he was getting the medication he needed. Maybe this could have been prevented. It's very sad.